welcome to another episode in the New Normal Toolkit built for you by the Institute of Directors in South Africa. I'm joined today by Faye Mukadam, Sarita Martin and Richard Foster, and they are all facilitators at the Institute of Directors in South Africa. Today we are going to discuss decision-making. Now, decision-making is something that every board member has to be really good at, listening to data, looking at information, looking at expert opinion, and then making decisions. And that used to be relatively tough. But where we are now, it is even tougher because we're living in a very fluid time with loads of uncertainty. We don't know if what we have decided now is even going to be legal or available tomorrow. And we just need to make these decisions faster than ever with less information than ever. So today the focus is going to be, and we're going to hear from the wisdom of our three panelists on how we should be making these decisions, what we should be taking into account, and what impact these decisions will have on the future of the companies we are directors on. Faye, I'm going to give you the first opportunity to answer a question that I'm going to pass over to Richard and Sarita. In terms of the decisions we make now, if we look at the well-being of the company and well-being of the stakeholders, well-being of employees, what are the various factors in this well-being other than financial we should be taking into account?
So I think that the most gratifying experience thus far on the ground has been looking at the amazing focus that leaders have had on their people. So whilst we've talked about people being assets and resources and being fundamental to the success and sustainability of the company in the way that you engage them, consult, approach, etc., and include them in decision making, it's really been gratifying to see that it's tested, and it was tested in a way that nobody quite expected. And so leaders have really stepped up to the challenge, and for me that's been very gratifying in the way that they have prioritized their people. So obviously the big push initially was around, well, we don't know how this is going to affect the value chain of business. And if there's no value chain, and if the economy has slowed down, there's no money turning around in the system, and that has a knock-on effect in terms of sustaining and paying not just your overheads but your people. Obviously, that has morphed now in terms of the pressures, the immediate pressures of not just the financial well-being and making payroll, but looking at the mental and emotional health and well-being of all our people. And I spoke to one of our CEOs last week, and he said what was interesting is for the first time, he's had to transcend that a buffer of HR, where HR is aware that there are some at-risk employees in terms of whether it's depression, alcoholism, etc. And so as a CEO, he's had to engage with these people a bit more frequently just to make sure that despite the lockdown and the virtual space we're all being forced to operate in, that there is that constant communication and support. And of course, what's also been interesting is the fact that everybody's had to skill up quite quickly, not just on being au fait on a virtual platform and understanding all the technical things. I think of also learning to let go, like we were chatting earlier about whether the dog's barking or the children happen to come in, just to relax about it. And more importantly, I think to understand that this overstimulation that we're experiencing, this uncertainty and the consequent anxiety that we're experiencing needs to be managed, and leaders and directors need to appreciate that sometimes it's important that your people are not switched on, that they actually are given permission to take the time out, and you've got to sometimes verbalize that it's okay, they won't be judged.
I absolutely agree. But I also know from, sitting around boardrooms, having the agenda, Richard, in your experience, well, maybe not in your experience, in your estimated guess at the moment, where is there space for this sort of discussion on the boardroom agenda? It's not something we talk about usually. How, should we leave it up to the CEO? Should we leave it up to the HR department? Is this really a boardroom discussion?
Janita, it's an interesting question that you pose, in terms of what did the old agenda look like? What should the new agenda look like? And, I've mentioned this before in terms of some of these principles, some of the embedded governance practices, etc., shouldn't we have been considering as leadership, the employees in an organization? You know, as leadership, we've had to cope with innovation, change, not to the same degree and perhaps not with the same pressure. But in chatting to HR directors and various other executives, well, you know what the problem is in the boardroom? Human capital sits somewhere down at the bottom of the agenda. How much time have we got left? So I think it's a case of, if you look at how this COVID-19 catalyst, as I call it, how it's accelerated things, it's a case of reprioritizing. Well, what is the risk? I would believe or guess that the risk of having people not able to perform, overstress, the issues around, we talk about wellness clinics, etc., those issues have got a lot greater. The risks have got a lot greater. So getting down to basic principles, well, if that risk's increased, management, how are we addressing that? We shouldn't have asked the question before, but that risk's perhaps gone from amber to bright red until you put in interventions to deal with, we keep talking about the new norm.
Mm-hmm. Sarita, from a leadership perspective, what skills do we need as directors now if we have to suddenly discuss the human side of things, the emotional side of things, the mental wellness of things, where it was often taboo to not go there and to keep it to hard facts? My father always said, put the facts on the table. Here there's no facts to put on a table because there isn't a table anymore. So what are some of the skills we need to develop as directors or tap into as directors to have those discussions that Richard highlighted just now?
You know, thanks, Jenny. So I think we always, on our Being a Director series, we say these are the skill sets you should have: curiosity, verbal communication skills, etc. And I think the one thing that was missing was empathy. In terms of how do you relate to other people, and are you empathetic to their situation? Not sympathetic, where I'm so sorry you're feeling this way, but empathetic. Do I actually understand what you are feeling? So I think that's the first thing, is that I would look for empathy. I would look for individuals who treat people as people. Not just because you are able to provide a service to me or because I need your skills, but because you're a person, and I understand that you are a person in a holistic view, as a parent, as a spouse, as a partner, as a mother, as a sister, as a parent, in that holistic view. So that is, I think, something that I think a lot of organizations have learned through this process. Do we actually understand what the health of our employees are? Because if we did, we would be able to deal with things in a much better manner. Do we understand? Shvay was mentioning the emotional aspect. Mental health is very, very important under these circumstances. Staying in your house for such a long period of time, and again, as Shvay was saying, not having access to or dealing with a basic need. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of need, as to, do I have food? I think those are not the discussions that many boardrooms are having. At this point in time, it's like, what's our cash flow? Are we going to make it through the next, what are we going to do for manufacturing? What if government doesn't lift these restrictions? Those are the discussions they're having. And I think what we're failing to realize is that we need people. Richard mentioned human capital. We need people to be able to do that. You can have all the facilities you want to in the world. You can have the greatest of strategy, but if you don't have anyone to do the work, then I think you've failed as an organization.
And the hard thing, the hard thing is to balance that understanding and that empathy with the legal contracts and the legal obligations you have. And Faye, I'm asking this to you from a legal point of view. We can have all the understanding in the world. We can have all of the lists and all of the surveys of what the basic needs of our employees are, what the mental needs are, etc., etc. Where's the responsibility of the company start and where does it end? Does it use the the assets that it has available, the cash that it has available, to now suddenly meet all of the basic needs of the employees at the cost of potentially losing the business? Or is the business responsibility now to say, well, we can only do so much, sorry for you, we get you, but it's not our problem?
Well, I think that, you know, we must always remember that when we talk about what the legal response is, that law started off, before it became doctrine and legislation, it started off being normative and really around guidelines in social constructs. So it really is driven by what works for the system. So that's just for me a foundational point. The next one is also that in answering your question, it would differ depending on the actual culture of the different organizations. And that's not the culture that is espoused in its integrated report or in the policies and procedures manuals, but rather the culture that's operating on the notice boards and in the corridors of the company. Now, if we juxtapose this entire discussion around leadership and what directors should be doing, you've got to act in the best interests of the company and all its stakeholders. And that means that you are, in these uncertain and fluid times, you've got to constantly balance not just competing but conflicting interests. And accept that you're not going to please everybody all the time, but you need to do what's in the best interests of everybody. And what's in the best interests of everyone in this time is to make sure that the business is sustainable. But sustainable in that you're going to have to make very harsh decisions, because the business sustainability might not look like what it looks now going into the future. So I would think some of the steps that management would take or would propose to the board for board approval would be around essentially trying to package things differently so that you retain, like I said, your risk and agility and your elasticity as a business. And that talks about reflecting the contraction in the economy, reflecting the contraction in the supply chain, and the fact that your income is now going to have been significantly reduced, if not stopped completely, and yet your expenses and your outflow, whilst it might have been reduced a little bit, it's still you're still carrying overheads that are sunken costs. And one of those is payroll. So if, for example, you are not getting paid by clients, yet you have to meet payroll, what do you do? And we've seen a widespread response the world over where management and boards have asked people to take salary cuts. They themselves have taken salary cuts. Executives have taken salary cuts. Non-executive directors have taken salary cuts. We've also then talked about negotiating with your suppliers, negotiating with your clients. And one of the boards that I sit on, what's been amazing and really touched my heart was the fact that clients said to the business, we do not want you to retrench any of your employees. So can we talk about what it is that you need from us, and we need from you to make sure that that is so. And so they have agreed to pay the company an average over the 3 months that they've taken from the last financial year of what the average invoice amount was, just so that people didn't have to lose their jobs. Now, again, I think what's difficult for me, and just tying into my previous answer, is the fact that management, CEOs and managing directors are under significant pressure because they've got to chat to their boards. The boards obviously need to be far more engaged than they were before, give guidance, make the decision, but then they've got to keep communicating with everyone so that you're seen as, like Sarita said, an empathetic and a caring employer. You've got to keep engaging, and then you've got to also make sure that the at-risk employees, the at-risk suppliers, the at-risk clients, actually you're the one who swoops in and takes care of that one-on-one, because I think that will make all the difference here. We're not talking just about cash, because I think a lot of people will come to the fore and see what they can do without and try and make it work, because everybody still wants to have somewhere to go, have a place to earn money, have an opportunity or a platform to be productive going forward.
Now, that's all good and well, and I do absolutely agree that it's up to us. This is not the time to sit and wait for someone else to change or wait for regulations to change or whatever it is to change, but it does make it harder to swoop. We've seen over the past few weeks in South Africa that some companies, some individuals have tried to swoop in and do the right thing, and they were fined for it. They were arrested for doing the right thing. So, Richard, within these strict limits that we now have, combined with the massive uncertainty, how do you then keep on communicating with each other as board, with your executive and the executive with all the other stakeholders, when you might not know what's going on, or if what you decide today to communicate tomorrow morning will carry through the night, if you won't just wake up in a new reality?
I think the information flow to the board has become critical from a legal point of view. I mean, we've discussed previously that one needs to make an informed decision, and you know, how do we get to that informed decision? What processes have we got in place within the organization? Can we rely on the management information, etc.? You know, things like disaster recovery plans or business continuity plans. You're told they're in place. As a director, it's your job to, with reasonable certainty, believe what you're told, and well, they are in place, but are you testing? Do you increase the amount of the testing? And I think the difficulty is with communication. The board still has to lead strategically. The board's role is never to become operational. So it's again trying to maintain that balance. Well, how much additional information do I need as a director? Is it correct? Can I rely on this information? And I think, you know, we are living in a world where information is not certain. Is information in context? The information that you receive may or may not be factual, may be fictitious, may not have been through the correct assurance processes. So I think it comes back to the skills that you perhaps need as a director is additional, or the upskilling is to rely on your experience and judgment on the issues. What are you getting? How far do you test it? Do you test this more than you would have previously? How do you balance this? And just on the, going back to what was said by Faye around the stakeholders, I think we live in a world where stakeholders are very dynamic. It's like a wagon wheel, or like one of these merry-go-rounds that you used to get at the fair with the horses. And they go up and down, and you put your kids on them, and round they go. And they go faster, and the music gets louder, but one horse goes up and the other comes down. And I think this is what we're faced with the board. So when you go to bed at night, do you know what that merry-go-round is going to look like the following morning? Which horse is going to be up? Which horse will be down? Where will the music be playing? And you know, the example I give is very basic, but at the end of the day, boards need to try and ensure they have the processes in place to know, well, which is now important, where do we prioritize, and where do we require management to focus their efforts, and it'll be a judgment call at the end of the day.
Sarita, does it then make sense to say that part of the skills a director and the board as a collective should have at the moment is to take a step back, is to not just charge, not just jump in, not just push for, and Faye alluded to this earlier, not just push for productivity, not just push for product, but taking a step back and doing things that are completely maybe alien to them.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, and it's quite interesting you use the word very alien, because we're so used to doing things in a particular manner. And as Richard was talking and Faye was talking, I made a couple of notes. One is that the communication skills are really important. I mean, Richard was saying, are we getting the right information? You know, information's all over. You don't know which is fake information. You don't know which is the real information. You don't know what models are being used. Okay, to make those decisions. You don't know how it's going to impact you. You don't know if you're going to wake up tomorrow and there's a new piece of regulation that's going to impact you. And so I think communication is very important from leadership, from the CEO in particular as the main communicator, and how he or she is putting the message across. Are you just saying, well, I'm sorry, we're changing the HR policy and here's it, okay? It's about how you get people. I was telling my 10-year-old son, I said, leaders need followers. So how do you get everybody within the organization to follow you, okay? So that's the first thing for me, is how you get that information across. And is everybody on the same page, or are they just saying, well, you're just cutting my salary, or not? As a board member, as a director, it is a very tenuous situation at the moment, because you might have one or two directors that are intimately involved as to what is going on, and then, you know, there's a flow through of information to the rest of the board. And when that happens, it's because we're not having board meetings, regular board meetings. And I read something interesting the other day, and it says board meetings are still going to continue. And actually, we should be having more board meetings, if anything, if you want that strategic direction. Whereas actually what's happened now is you've got one or two non-executive directors working intimately with management, and they know what's going on. But we have a collective duty here. We have collective responsibility and collective liability. I can't go before a judge on the business judgment rule and say, oh, well, actually these 5 directors or 4 directors were working with management. He sent us a message and I had to accept it. Okay, yeah. I don't think that's going to fly in any court of law if the business judgment rule is tested. So for me, there's a lot around communication, how you communicate, and respect for the fact that this is what the role of the board is, this is what the role of management is. And yes, I understand that you know, we all can't be around the table, you know, giving advice or guidance to management, but at the end of the day, I've got to trust to that level that I will be able to stand up in court and defend myself on any decision.
Talking about courts and defending, one thought that occurred to me, and Faye and Richard, I would like your opinion on both of this, or both of your opinion on this, before we get to the courts, where we have to explain by the business judgment rule, all of these things. How do we discipline within a board, especially if now we know one of our board members or the chairperson, company secretary, etc., might be in a challenging situation. We might not know their situation. We might find out things that gives us information about their mental well-being, about their emotional well-being, that drives them to not necessarily show up as much as other board members. How do we then be empathetic, as well as practice the necessary discipline around the boardroom table to get the company through this time as best as possible? Faye, first you, and then Richard, same question.
So, you know, it's a lead on to your previous question. So there is law, first of all, and even, you know, you asked earlier about legal implications, and there's guidance, and there's fines and penalties, etc. But it's almost as if you've got this procedure in place, and then if you tell the SAPs or the army that nobody's allowed to be out after 9 o'clock, then you trust in the fact that there's going to be an element of discretion and independent judgment. And then you hear the, you know, one-offs of 9:15 people being thrown into jail or whatever, you know. So it is difficult when you're dealing with a lot of people. I think when you're dealing with the board, and they are, and I'm not sure about the complete context of what you're thinking, because you're dealing with discipline issues, versus emotional or mental or other well-being considerations. So if I am a struggling board member and I'm just not coping, and it could be the case that I am reliant on board sitting fees, or maybe my job itself isn't paying me any money, and so I could be under pressure, or I was on the cusp of a divorce and now I'm stuck at home with, you know, the person who I'd prefer to murder. So it's those kinds of things. How do you respond to that and manage? I think it's the chairpersons, first of all. Well, let's hope it's not the chairperson who's battling, but it would be the chairperson's role to proactively engage with the directors. And what is unfortunate is that leaders often respond based on an event or an occurrence, as opposed to, just like we're talking about information flow, empathy, compassion, nowhere, anywhere, on any platforms have we talked about how are the leaders doing here. So has the chairman or chairperson actually engaged with the MD or the CEO and say, how are you doing? Has the chairperson engaged with the board members and say, how are you doing? You too are people, ordinary people, absorbing this madness at the same time. So I think that needs to be asked, and there needs to be engagement. Obviously, if there's a discipline issue where, for example, your board member was caught transgressing what was a clear regulation or a clear directive under the Disaster Management Act, or maybe contravening something, a policy that is company policy or that was agreed by the board, then the chairperson should, the fact that we are in lockdown, shouldn't, maybe you can be a bit more empathetic because there might be other contextual pressures, but surely the mandate of the chairperson is the same, and the mandate of the board is the same, and that is to hold each other accountable. And if it means that the action was significant or severe enough to warrant significant discipline or a response, then you can surely look at suspension, etc. But going back to what Richard said earlier, what happens at times of stress and pressure is our processes are tested. So yes, on the one hand, it's an opportunity because, oh my goodness, we didn't think this would happen and now we have an opportunity. But as leaders, we can't always use that as a cop-out, because that's the point of having a board, is that you look for, like I said, the flock of black swans. And it's not just the bad stuff. A black swan's a beautiful thing. So you look for the opportunities as well. And then you say, well, what should I do? How should I discipline accordingly? And of course, the punishment must always meet the crime. I mean, it shouldn't be too harsh. Everybody's struggling at the moment. And so when we're talking about law is clear, it's clear, it's definitive. Well, not always, but in terms of certain rules. And yet, I don't think that this context and the time that we're living in now always requires us to default to what does the law say.
Richard, your thoughts?
I guess at the end of the day, defaulting to the law, I mean, the law is the law, no matter what the conditions, and one needs to comply with the law. So I think Faye's covered this quite extensively, but what I would like to add, particularly from the chairman's point of view, perhaps what we can pick up on, the chair's job is to drive and ensure the right culture within the board. And, I reiterate, you don't need COVID to bring up some of these issues where you may have a company secretary or a certain director that aren't coping with certain issues. There could be huge strikes in a company, etc. I mean, they could have been facing various other consequences. I mean, there were companies going SAA, looking at business rescue, or had a massive strike. It had nothing to do with COVID. So a lot of these things, again, are not new. When business is going well, as Faye alluded to, everything's fine. And the governance systems, and I think the people as well, including the chair, will be tested far more in times of crisis like this. Just one of the things Faye said, well, it's for what if the chairman is having difficulty, and people are human. So, you default again in terms of governance, lead independent director. Have you got those systems, processes in place? Have you built up the relationships? Have you got the culture within the board? So yes, the chairman's responsible, drive the right culture within the board. You need to performance manage, I hate using that term, but performance manage the directors. That's actually what the job's about today. Or conduct the orchestra. If you realize that certain section of the orchestra are battling because of whatever reason, you as the chair need to sit down and address it. Same with the CEO, and I've mentioned this before, that link between management and the board is so important. How is the CEO doing? To sit down and say, well, I'm not worried about the, not that I'm not worried about the company, but how are you doing?
Yeah.
And I've seen that play out. Actually ask the question, forget about the company. How are you doing as a person? Because you know what? The grapevine, certain things have materialized. And what is your job? To ensure that you have the right person who's capable of delivering in the job. And this is why when you look at the chair, you look at the chair's role and you say, you need people. We talk about empathy. We've got to start talking about very high EQ to understand these issues, to be able to get into them. It's not a case of soft and fluffy. It's understanding people in the boardroom at strategic level in order to ensure that they can deliver on their mandate.
And not only now, but into the future. So the final question I'm going to pose to the panel is, how do we make decisions not only for crisis mode now, for survival now, but how do we, everybody says it's a new normal. It's never going to be the same again. But no one is saying what is going to look like. How do we make the types of decisions now that can create the new normal for us, so that we're not in a position that it happens to us again, but where we can start reviewing the information we've got available, learning from history, put our innovative thinking caps on, maybe learning from others outside the traditional boardroom setup, outside the director profile, to start making decisions for the future. Is it something we should be doing now, Sarita, or is the timing just off? Should we not be thinking about the future now?
I think, Anita, not to think about the future now would be irresponsible of directors.
I agree.
You have to learn to live with this virus and its impact, because we do not know with any degree of certainty how long it's going to be with us. And life doesn't just stop. Life carries on. So you've got to really learn to live with this virus. And I think that's one of the strategic role. I mean, that's the role of the board, is strategy. And looking at strategic options and taking this as an input, like we do with any strat session. Take it as an input to say, how are we going to manage this? Because that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to manage it. And you're going to have to also see, if I go back to the people aspect, you're going to have to see whether you have the right people in place to manage it. If I've got someone who's breaking down because they overwhelmed with, COVID-19 is going, and it's not sort of leadership I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone who's calm, collected, able to manage in a very uncertain environment, with good leadership, good communication. So definitely, I think that boards need to continue to look at that long-term strategy. We're going to come out of this at a certain point in time, hopefully. Or we're going to look a little bit different, but we're still going to be here. Okay, so at the end of the day, your strat sessions should continue. You may need to tweak them. You may need to say, I'm putting this on hold, but I'm going to focus on that because, these are the industries that are being impacted. They are being imposed on us in a way. But life carries on. Board meetings carry on. And I think that directors need to understand that. You can't just stand still and say, okay, let's just wait until everything's over and then we start thinking. You start thinking from now. And actually, this is the best time to start thinking, in my opinion, for boards, because they're thinking differently. It's no longer that normal board meeting and strat session. Let's review our strategic assumptions. And let's accept our strategy and adopt it for the next year. But now let's think differently. And I think it's going to be absolutely amazing to see what will come out if we have the right leadership in our chair, our CEO, our directors, and our executives.
I absolutely agree, and that is such an inspirational message. But there's this one word that keeps in the back of my mind saying, but what if? And that's the fluidity. So we're living in uncertain times, but it's, as you said, Faye, a little bit earlier, it's not just fast-paced, it's fluid. It is, and the term fluid describes it so well to me. No uncertainty, no time limit, no time for anything. We have nothing of the previous left. How do you create a future from the boardroom perspective when everything you've got is fluid?
So I almost want to appeal to leaders to say, let's stop using new normal. Because what that does, it's almost self-limiting in a way, because it still uses normal as a baseline and then an adjusted view or perspective of normal. So there's a change from the normal. So it's almost, if I were to paraphrase it, say, don't think out of the box, there is no box.
There is no box.
So that we don't know. And in fact, from a director's perspective and the stuff we teach in our Being a Director series, for example, where we talk about that risk agility, and we say to leaders, you need to learn to embrace and internalize the fact that business is fluid, contexts are fluid. Something that might be happening in a country far, far away will inevitably impact you. And we're seeing it now, certainly with the global supply chains and the impact and how it's having a serious impact on geopolitical shifts in those issues. So as a leader, you first of all, I think at the board level, need to start off with your business continuity plan, because we've talked about black swans a lot, but remember we always go back to risk, and the Chinese in terms of the way that they depict risk in the symbols that they use is both opportunity and threat. So either way, it is anything that is going to impact you or have an impact on your business achieving its strategic objectives, whether it is positive or negative. And that is what business continuity is really about. So if we're saying now that it's COVID and we don't know what's going to happen after this lockdown, all we're saying is, I think Richard mentioned, have the information available, but also have a view. Hope is not a strategy. Like Sarita said, you can't be sitting around now saying, okay, let's just press pause and let's look at what's going to happen afterwards. You need to, whether you're using your PESTEL or your SWOT, you'll be able to see, if we were to take out from PESTEL your economic line item or indicator, or your technological indicator, you can see that from this discussion today, if we were to have this discussion tomorrow again or in 48 hours, it would be markedly different in terms of the realities that we could be using as examples. So we need to be mindful of not just what we need to do in terms of actual decision making. And for me, it's more whether it's a skill or a characteristic or a trait that we need to develop until it becomes as comfortable for leaders as if it were breathing or reading a board pack. In that, you don't know. Get over it. Build a bridge. Uncertainty is actually, if you want to use it, it is then the new normal. And you need to be okay with that. And that's why when we talk, we should focus on business continuity plans, where disaster recovery is a section of a business continuity plan. And one of those things, it's not just COVID or the lockdown. It's really about, well, what can we package now to sell differently? How do we save and redeploy our resources, reallocate things now that we don't have to spend time commuting, for example? So, you know, the one appeal is also to not be doom and gloom. There's always a way. Where there is breath, there is hope. Although not to use hope as a strategy, but, you know, we've got incredible leaders, incredible intellectual capacity in our country, and it must be deployed in embracing uncertainty.
Thank you so much, Faye. Richard, I'm going to hand over to you for final comments and wrapping up the conversation that went from making decisions, keeping people into account, keeping legalities in mind, and also keeping the future in account. What are your final thoughts on all of this and how we make decisions from today forward?
I mean, interesting listening to Faye, and she said we must deploy people, we must deploy leadership. We must upskill people. So who do we need to upskill? If we need to upskill directors, what do they need to learn about? Maybe what good corporate governance is. And I mean, I say it a little bit provocatively, but if you get down to the basics and look at, well, how should we have been governing this organization? We need to understand how the risks are changing. We need to understand what the strategy needs to be today, and you know, with adjusted timeframes. So one then starts to move into, well, do we understand good governance, the triple context, the economic, the environment, and social. And at this point in time, environment's great. I mean, there's no problem there. And in fact, COVID's having a positive effect in many instances. We're focusing on the social issues. So it's a case of understanding that decision-making needs to be made in the triple context, and then playing that across the 6 capitals. And, you know, during the course of this, this discussion, we've heard both Sarita and Faye talk about human capital, etc., etc. So as leadership, do we understand, first of all, what those 6 capitals are, and how should we be focusing at board level on those capitals? And like an agenda, how do we reprioritize? Digital, well, that sits within a capital. Human resources, again, that sits within a capital. Natural capital, well, at this point in time, I hate to say it, but has that dropped a little bit below in terms of priority? Because the risks aren't there at the moment. So we need to focus on the other areas. So my closing comment is better directors need to better understand what good governance is and ensure that it is embedded in the business. And I think organizations will be in a far stronger position to move forward and not only mitigate the current risk, but take some of the opportunities which may present themselves. And COVID is one point in time. We're going to be dealing with other issues, and you know, whether it's not 48 hours, but a year, 2 years, and we'll look back at this. So the lessons learned and apply good governance.
Faye, Richard, Sarita, thank you so very much for sharing so freely of your wisdom. We truly appreciate it. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.